Mountains, trees and rocks are easy to use in mnemonics, but what do you do with character components whose meanings are general, abstract or overlapping? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode we are going to talk about using mnemonics to learn Chinese characters. Memory techniques typically rely on connecting concepts in vivid and memorable ways, which is awesome if you want to learn compound characters in Chinese. Most introductions to how to use mnemonics to learn Chinese characters, including my own, cherry-picks examples to make it sound easier than it actually is though. The meaning of some components is just easier to use in mnemonics than others. For example, concrete nouns are the easiest, so mountain, tree and rock are easy to form mnemonics with. So what do you do with components whose meanings are abstract or general or just hard to picture? If this is the first time you hear about mnemonics, or maybe the first time you hear about it in connection with learning Chinese characters, I strongly suggest you check out my article Remembering is a Skill You Can Learn, Mnemonics for Chinese Learners, which is episode 293 on the podcast. You should probably also check out the article How to Make Chinese Easier by Using Mnemonics and Memory Techniques, which is a direct follow-up to the previous article I mentioned. This is episode 304 on the podcast, and as usual I will put links in the show notes. If you're entirely new to learning Chinese characters and don't know what a compound character is and why building blocks are important, I will also put links to a series of articles I've written about that, which are also accessible on the podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about building blocks that are not easy to associate with each other, either because they are vague or general in themselves, or because they overlap with each other. In other words, we're going to talk about the tricky components that can't just be directly associated with each other, i.e. all the cases that are usually left out of introductory articles to using mnemonics for learning Chinese characters. In essence, we have three problems with three distinct solutions. First, general or perhaps vague meanings can be visualized but are too broad. For example, mountain and weapon can be visualized, but the image is too vague and risks creating overlap or vagueness that will make them harder to remember. Second, abstract meanings aren't easy to picture directly. So what if a component means good, already, or self? These are not concepts that lend themselves easily to visualization, and so you need a few tricks to do that. And third, overlapping meanings require distinct mnemonics. You might think that saying ancient weapon is enough for a component, but when it turns out that there are 3 or 4 components that all mean different types of ancient weapons, you realize that this is not specific enough. Before we dive in, I want to comment a little bit on the language I use when talking about mnemonics. I say things like visualize or create pictures or imagine, but these things don't have to be visual. In other words, you don't need to have a mental image of the association or story that you come up when you create your mnemonic. Mnemonics can be based on many things, simply a narrative or story which isn't visual, or you can use other senses. There are, after all, people who can't really visualize things in that sense, and they can still use mnemonics. But I'm going to say picture and visualize and things like that because it's much easier than the convoluted way I would have to word things to catch all possible alternatives. So let's dig into the first category, and here the general lesson is to create specific images for character components with general meanings. As already mentioned, some concepts are easy to visualize, so when you see that a character or character component means mountain, you have an idea of what a mountain looks like. Still, this is usually not specific enough to create good mnemonics. Instead of thinking of just mountain, think of a very specific mountain. For example, you can picture a cartoon mountain with 3 absurdly sharp peaks. Or for something like rock, you can think of a specific rough boulder which is too heavy to lift. And for tree, you can think of that gnarled apple tree outside your grandmother's house. The reason these are easier to remember is related to the Baker-Baker effect. And for more about this, check McWeeny et al. 1987. So if one group is told that someone is a baker, and another group is told that the person's surname is Baker, so with a capital B, the first group is more likely to remember the word, even though the word itself is the same. The reason is that the profession baker is associated with a lot of specific things, such as experiences or impressions, maybe of ovens, hot bread, flour, etc. The surname Baker, on the other hand, doesn't do any of this. It's just a name, an arbitrary label. Incidentally, if you want to get better at remembering people's names, connecting their names, which are then arbitrary labels, to specific instances, such as remembering that someone's surname is Baker by thinking of an actual baker, works really well. As discussed in one of the earlier articles and episodes about using mnemonics to learn Chinese characters, having very specific images also help you with interactions, because a specific tree can interact with a specific rock in a way that the general concept of rock or the general concept of tree really can't. In general, abstract things are harder to remember, so make things as concrete as possible. This is indeed the second problem that we're going to talk about now, and the lesson here is that you should try to anchor abstract character components with something concrete. I mentioned a few examples already when I said that good or self are rather abstract, and it's not obvious how you would draw these or how you would picture them. In these cases, you shouldn't try to use the dictionary definition of the component or the character, but instead try to create what's called a peg. So a peg is essentially something concrete that is used as a stand-in for something harder to memorize. So for example, if you think that self is difficult to memorize, you can come up with something concrete that you can memorize instead, and you just need to learn that when you have this concrete thing, it's actually a stand-in for self. One very useful thing here is that if we look at how the Chinese writing system evolved, these concrete things usually came first, and then many of these concrete characters were used to represent more abstract things. So for example, the ancient Chinese, when they started writing, they didn't have a good way of representing self either, so they used a character that already existed, that meant nose. One way of explaining this logical step is to say that you point to your own nose to indicate yourself. If you look at the Chinese character zi, meaning self, it originally did depict and mean a nose, and the meaning of self came later. This doesn't always work, and it doesn't mean you have to study ancient Chinese writings every time you want to create a mnemonic. I'm just bringing it up because often there is a more concrete meaning to the character that you're trying to learn. If it doesn't work, you can just make something up, but of course, as usual when we talk about mnemonics, it's better to not make things up if you don't have to, and the reason for this is not that I'm a purist, it's just that when you make stuff up, you don't learn anything about the Chinese language. In contrast, if you look something up and learn that zi meant nose instead of using an arbitrary image of your own, this can indeed be useful later, and you might learn more about how Chinese works by doing this. So the takeaway for abstract components is that you need to make them concrete some way or another, otherwise it's very hard to incorporate them into mnemonics. This brings us to the third problem, which is overlapping meanings, and the solution here is to be more distinct and specific. I've mentioned this in the episode already, but if you encounter a specific component and you see that it's some kind of ancient weapon, this might seem enough for now, but later you might stumble upon more components that also are some kind of ancient weapon, and then you will mix them up, and there might be large sets of characters that you get wrong because you mix up which ancient type of weapon it was. This problem can sometimes be hard to even identify, because it's not that you get one specific character wrong, it's that you keep mixing up which component should go into several characters, and you might get each wrong many times before you realize what the problem is. In a sense, this is very similar to dealing with Chinese characters you keep mixing up in general, not specifically for mnemonics as we're talking about here. This is also something we talked about on the podcast recently, namely in episode 309. So to give you an example here that can tie together some of the concepts we've talked about so far, let's look at three different ancient weapons. First, we have Ge, which is a dagger axe or a halberd-like weapon. Second, we have Mao, which is a spear or lance. And third, we have Shu, which is a staff-like weapon or cudgel. To actually see the characters, please refer to the written article on Hacking Chinese. You don't really need to see the characters to understand the problem though. The definitions I gave here are already much clearer than you will get from most dictionaries. For example, when I looked up Shu, the third example here in a dictionary, it said spear, which is probably not a good translation, and that brings it very close to the other two. So the way to do this is to be specific, and if you can be historically accurate, that's good, but it's not a requirement. So here is what I do for these three. So first for ge, I imagine a pole arm with a side blade sticking out. This is reasonably historically correct and is also represented in the character. For Mao, I imagined a straight spear without a side blade. And for Shu, I just think of a cudgel. Like I said, this might not be historically perfect, but it's reasonably good, and we are language learners here, not historians. The most important thing is that these images are distinct, and if we connect that back to what I said earlier about specific instances of something being easier to associate and do specific things with, we can apply that here as well. So ge can chop or slash, Mao can pierce, and Shu can crush or bludgeon. These actions don't overlap and so minimize the risk that you will mix them up. Now, it should be clear here that if you just think some kind of ancient weapon when you see these three components, that won't really cut it, because you will mix these up. There are worse examples though, because when it came to these weapons, at least if you have some kind of idea of ancient weaponry in English, you know what a cudgel is, you know what a halberd is, and you know what a spear is. But what about components that have abstract meanings in themselves and also overlap? A good example of this are characters that mean I or me. Here we have 4 examples. The most common one that everybody already knows is 我. Then we also have U, and another one, which is, to add insult to injury, also pronounced U. And finally we have 无. These are generally not used to mean I or me in modern Mandarin, but they mean that or can mean that in classical Chinese. This means that if these appear as components in other characters and you look them up in a dictionary, you might have 4 characters that all seem to mean roughly the same thing. And if you don't know about classical Chinese grammar and know the ins and outs of these pronouns, you can't really rely on the same method we used for the weapons earlier. The strategy we're going to use here is the same as we've used before, or rather it's a combination of 2 things. First, we want to be concrete rather than abstract, and second, we want to be distinct, so we make sure that the images are different from each other. So here is how I do it, and I've tried to keep some things that are actually true about these characters and mix them up with some imagination. So for the first character, 我, which means I in modern Mandarin, I use a concrete image of myself, namely the one I use on social media. This is very concrete and, as we shall see, distinct from the rest. The second character, yu, means I in classical Chinese, but it also means in excess of, at least in simplified Chinese. To remember this, I imagine an old version of myself, where I have everything in excess except teeth. For short, I call this old me. The third character is yu, which also means I in classical Chinese. It can be pronounced yu with other meanings too. And since this one looks so similar to zi, child, I think of myself as I appear in photos from when I was 2 or so. In short, this is young me. Finally, we have wu, which can also mean I in classical Chinese. And here I imagine myself as a 5-mouthed monster, all mouths screaming at once. I call this Monster Me, and if you don't know what this character looks like, it consists of 2 components. We have 5 and under that mouth. Obviously, this has nothing to do with how this character came about, and so this is perhaps a good opportunity to talk about how closely we should stick to the real story behind the characters that we're trying to remember. This is something we have discussed in detail before, namely in an article called 5 Levels of Understanding Chinese Characters, Superficial Forms to Deep Structure. And if you want to tune into the podcast, it's episode 29. Essentially, we should try to stay away from mnemonics and images that hide the real meaning and the real structure of characters, but this doesn't mean it's always better to know more. Well, if your goal is to understand the writing system, that would be the case, but I'm assuming that your goal is to remember how to read and write the characters, not their origins per se. I mentioned this earlier, that if you make something up, it can be useful in this specific case, but it will never help you with anything else. So for example, we could think that the character ge that we talked about earlier, so that's the dagger axe, is a giraffe, and that Mao is a toothpick, and that Shu is my old mathematics teacher. At first this might seem okay, these are very specific images, they are easy to incorporate into mnemonics and so on. The problem is that this is not how these characters came about, and by making these things up I didn't learn anything. Another problem is that if you have completely arbitrary pegs like this, it's very hard to remember them, and you basically have to write all these things down. What if you forget that your mathematics teacher is supposed to be Shu and not Mao? Well, you need to have a list then and write this down, and every time you forget, you need to look it up. But if you stick to the real meaning, first, you are less likely to forget because there might be some connection between the character form and the image you have associated with it, but you can also just look in a dictionary. It's also important to remember that when we learn a component in a compound, the goal is not only to learn this specific compound, because most components appear over and over in other compounds. Since I made up giraffe, toothpick, and my old mathematics teacher, this doesn't really help me understand these other compounds. But if I know what these characters really mean, it can often help understanding new characters and creating mnemonics for those. Because of course the ancient Chinese didn't just randomly include components, they did so for a reason. Now, including a component because of what it means was just one of these. You can also include them because of how they sound, for example, but meaning and semantic components are still important. But don't let this stop you. If you think that the real explanation is too complicated or not very helpful, make something up. So far in this episode, I've just assumed that you know how to look up all the things you need to create mnemonics. For example, what does this character component mean, and what was the original meaning of 字, self, for example. If you just look these characters up, for example the ancient weapons I already mentioned, you will see that some dictionaries have wildly different definitions, and sometimes they overlap even more, as was the case with spear I mentioned earlier. I rely on two resources for this, and these are the only ones you need, I think. The first one is the Outlier Dictionary of Chinese Characters. This is a paid add-on to Pleco, but it's a once-off payment and it's well worth it. This will give you all the information you need about most characters you want to learn. If you don't want to use that, there is also a free alternative called Zi Tools, so that's zi.tools. And this is a website that offers much more information about Chinese characters than you can possibly want, and indeed the main problem is that it's much harder to navigate and find the things that you want, whereas in Outlier's dictionary they present this fairly clearly and it's targeted at you as a second language learner. Before we wrap this episode up, I want to issue two warnings. First, use other people's mnemonics carefully. It's very tempting to use other people's mnemonics. Maybe they are included in the app that you use, or you've searched and found something that looks useful online. And of course, if it is useful in the sense that it actually works, well, then it works. But the problem with other people's mnemonics is that they don't tend to be as clear for you or as distinct for you as they are for the person who created them. Before you adopt any mnemonic somebody else has created, ask yourself if the image is concrete enough. Is it distinct enough from other similar images you might have, and can it interact with other elements in a useful way? The second warning is to not use mnemonics for everything. As should be clear by now, creating mnemonics takes a lot of time. Figuring out the ancient weapons and making sure you have consistent mnemonics across characters and so on takes an awful lot of time. You need to look things up, you need to do research, write things down, etc. And this is just a preparatory stage, is to prepare the components that will then go into compounds. And when you encounter the compounds, you need to create mnemonics for those. This is in itself not a problem, but it comes with a huge opportunity cost. You could have done many more useful things with that time, such as reading more, conversing with people in Chinese, or all sorts of things. So use mnemonics when you need them, especially when you keep forgetting a specific character or compound, or when you confuse two or more similar characters over and over, or perhaps when the meaning is too abstract or too general to stick easily. For more about this last point, check out Don't Use Mnemonics for Everything When Learning Chinese, which is episode 229. To conclude this episode, we can say that components are difficult, but they are not difficult in the same way, and the solution is different. If the meaning is general, make it specific. If it's too abstract, find a concrete anchor. And if several meanings overlap, make the images deliberately distinct. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.